So, Danny, the playbook for messing around in the U.S. political system seems very not complicated to me. You hack people, you run targeted propaganda campaigns online, and then you dump money on lobbyists and think tanks. Are the Chinese following that playbook? And if not, why not?
Well, fortunately for us, thus far, they haven't been very good at it.
Okay.
Imagine what the world would look like if
No
the
kidding.
Chinese were as good as the UAE when it comes to manipulating Washington and employing lobbyists. They also aren't quite like the Russians, or they haven't been in terms of really just straight up wanting to fuck with us in our elections. They're dyed-in-the-wool Marxists, and they're reasonably confident that the slow rot of capitalism is going to, collapse the West in due course. But
Them and a lot of Twitter think that, yeah.
it may be that partly as a result of the current Operation Piss Off the Panda, that they're changing up a bit and might be willing to give the U.S. a little more of a push down the steps.
Yeah.
The areas where they're really screwing with us, of course, are in the technology and in the economic field, where they've made a fortune taking advantage of this sort of duality of being the world's biggest developing nation at the same time that they're one of the world's biggest developed nations. The problem is that, we used to joke about the Chinese always, claiming win-wins.
Right, in negotiations.
Yeah, well, we're pretty close to locking down a lose-lose, because the current trade battle and technology battle isn't solving any problems. It's exacerbating them. It's sort of a duel with chainsaws, and nobody's going to come away whole from that. And when you look at the praise heaped on the Trump administration for creating leverage and for challenging China, you really got to ask yourself, okay, what have they accomplished? What have they done? What have they gotten from all of that leverage, and at what cost? So there's no redress on forced tech transfer, on IPR theft, market access, industrial subsidies, all of those things. Those aren't even really locked into the agreement that blew up.
Right.
That was all, largely about soybeans and, some generalized commitments on non-tariff barriers. And they couldn't close that deal.
Right. So we're not even addressing the major irritants in the relationship.
I'd go one step further in saying that we're creating a political environment in which no one who's involved in decision-making in China dares to advocate for reform, dares to stand up and encourage shifts in the direction that we're asking for, because the United States is defining the relationship as implacably adversarial.
Right. Yeah, right. I mean, certainly the Steve Bannon worldview is shining through. So, I mean, the trade war with China is escalating. I'm curious who you think has more leverage or can absorb more economic pain. But in addition to that, I mean, there was a really brusque back and forth this week between U.S. and Chinese officials at a defense summit in Singapore. The Chinese were particularly pissed off about increased support from the U.S. for Taiwan.
Yeah.
How much do you worry about this escalating into something worse than a trade war, into something a little more, even more contentious?
Yeah, because I was saying, Danny, like I'm curious what you think about this, because it's almost like, have they discovered Taiwan? Like, in other words, if the Trump people really wanted to push the Chinese buttons, they could start messing around there. I've been wondering if they would go there to try to find another way to mess with China, or to have leverage on the Chinese, to say we might start playing a little more footsie with the Taiwanese.
Well, I think there's plenty of evidence of that already. The thing to worry about, perhaps more than the risks of pushing the Chinese buttons on Taiwan, is the administration accidentally elbowing a big button on Taiwan without understanding what it is that they're doing.
Yeah.
There isn't a lot of erudition and research that goes into the decisions, apparently, by the president, who's largely informed by his gut and occasionally by John Bolton. Look,
Gut in the stash. That's all I got in this world.
I mean, the MO seems to be release the hounds, hellfire and fury, and everybody should do whatever they can to unsettle and backfoot the Chinese right now. And that this is, I think, in the president's mind, all in service of being able to close an incrementally better deal on U.S. exports and a
Yeah.
few other odds and ends that he cares deeply about. The problem is, like so many of these initiatives that he's taken, the end result isn't going to be better than we could have gotten through more conventional and collaborative negotiations. It's going to fall vastly short, as it already does with China, of his great claims of what he was going to get. And it comes at an insanely high price. The Chinese have, shall we say, long memories.
Yes.
You know that Italian thing about revenge served cold?
Yes.
Well, Marco Polo brought that back with spaghetti, you know? Like they invented it.
Yeah.
So why are we gratuitously fucking with these guys? There's a lot to complain about. There's a lot to push back on in terms of Chinese behavior. But if you're randomly pushing buttons and you hit a South China Sea button, you hit a Xinjiang button, you hit a Taiwan button, sooner or later, you're
Yeah.
going to get a reaction that you weren't prepared for and that you don't want.
One question that I wrestle with, Danny, is that on the one hand, Trump has been a huge opportunity for China, right? Because what I find, when I travel across Asia or Southeast Asia, is the perceived diminution of U.S. presence and influence is palpable, and that the Chinese are the main beneficiary, right? So they have their Belt Road Initiative, they're expanding their influence economically, commercially, and politically across Asia, across Africa, across Latin America. So they benefit from Trump's America First, belligerence, unpredictability, et cetera. On the other hand, they are getting rattled by tariffs, and there has been an effect on their economy. They seem completely fed up with the seesaw of these negotiations. And I'm wondering if you're sitting in Beijing right now in year 3 of the Trump administration, for the Chinese, are you looking at this as we want 4 more years of this to consolidate our expanded influence at the expense of the U.S.? Or are you looking at this and saying, like, okay, we've banked all the influence that we're going to get out of the U.S. taking this crazy turn, and we hope that the U.S. Comes back to its senses?
Well, opportunism is a big part of Chinese international relations and strategy, but it is a distant second to stability.
Predictability.
That is
stability.
what they
Yeah,
absolutely crave. And they've made no secret about it over the years, and this continues to be at the center of their global strategy. They want a stable, secure, predictable environment in order to allow them to put the finishing touches on the internal pieces of the great national rejuvenation. They want relations with the United States, which in their view is a decaying power anyway, to stay on an even keel. They have misread Trump, as I think most people have repeatedly. They certainly believed that Trump would be vastly better for China's interests than Hillary Clinton, who they feared and loathed. Once he came into office, they were confident that he's a businessman and they could find his bottom line. But what they discovered is he's not a businessman. He's an entertainer with autocratic overtones. And he has been utterly unpredictable. Sometimes they have been able to take advantage of that, but other times they've really paid a big price for it. So, no, they would trade the advantages they get
that's interesting.
in a heartbeat.
To get rid of fascist P.T. Barnum. Okay, let's do a little history. So we're recording this on Tuesday, the 4th, which is the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. I bet a lot of people listening have seen the famous photo of Tank Man. You've heard of the term, but don't really know what happened. Danny, can you tell us why were students and citizens in China protesting, and what happened on June 4th, 1989?
Well, the thing to remember is that this 1989 was a year of considerable turmoil in the communist world. This was glasnost and perestroika. It was about 10 years after the Cultural Revolution in China and the death of Mao Zedong. And Deng Xiaoping had begun a series of steps aimed at economic reform. I remember reading when I was a kid about the French Revolution somewhere that revolutions happen when things start getting better, not when they're at their worst. That the reforms liberate forces that become hard to control. And that's very much what seems to have happened in the late 80s in China, where students, workers, people throughout the country, this was not just in Beijing, not just in Tiananmen Square, became very agitated about corruption, about unfairness. There was a serious upsurge in political protests throughout the country. And Tiananmen Square became ground zero for student protests. And at one point, there was apparently something in the neighborhood of 1 million people
Wow.
camped out.
It's like an OG Tahrir Square.
Exactly. in
A
that
million
area.
people.
So I'm told.
Wow.
So this started a big debate, or maybe exacerbated a big debate within the Chinese leadership between hardliners and reformers. And ultimately, Deng Xiaoping, who was the paramount leader at the time, made a fundamental decision that has really shaped modern China since then, which was there is no price too high to pay for the preservation of the authority of the Communist Party. And that reform is important, but a precondition for reform is absolute security and ideological control and conformity. So based on that, he called in the army. And the army rolled in and started shooting. And so beginning the night of June the 3rd, overnight and into the following day, something on the order of 10,000 people were killed.
Wow.
And many, many more were, of course, injured. The really astonishing thing, though, is the success that the party has had in the ensuing 30 years in this Orwellian effort to airbrush out of history the very fact of Tiananmen.
Well, so can I just ask you about that? I mean, what would happen if I were a young teacher living in Beijing and I tried to teach my class about Tiananmen Square, or if I tried to search for Tiananmen Square on my computer in China?
Well, most Chinese don't know enough to teach or to search.
Wow.
But today, even the numbers 6, 4, 89 in pretty much any combination are considered to be a political offense. They're essentially outlawed. Teaching what happened at the Tiananmen Massacre is completely unacceptable in Chinese political society. The Chinese have a lot of tools to correct bad behavior, and it ranges from being called into the security office for tea, losing your job, having now your social credit score adjusted so that you can't buy a ticket on a high-speed rail, you can't get a passport, et cetera, or worse. This is a non-event, although I heard this year for the very first time a Chinese official publicly defend Tiananmen. It's quite rare for them even to admit that such a thing happened. In effect, what they were saying was it was highly unfortunate that those students compelled the government to commit
to
such
kill
a
them,
distasteful act.
Do you think? I mean, Danny, you're familiar with this debate, but I think it'd be useful for our listeners. I think the basic consensus that has emerged in recent years is that the U.S. policy community after Tiananmen doubled down on the bet that opening up to China, bringing China in the WTO, bringing China in from the wilderness into the international order would over time promote not just economic liberalization, but that economic liberalization would lead to some form of political liberalization, right? And so that was kind of the frame of mind of people in the U.S. certainly through the 90s and the aughts. And now, of course, what we've seen is the economic opening in China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. That is clearly good. It has served to make China more of a stakeholder in the international system. I think that is generally good. But clearly, the political dynamic has gotten worse inside China, not better. And if you look at the million Uyghurs in detention, if you look at the use of state surveillance, if you look at the crackdown on pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong, which was supposed to be a one country, two systems situation where Hong Kong enjoyed greater civil liberties, and the repression of even any mention of Tiananmen, as you talked about. I mean, I guess I'm less interested in the, like, did we get this wrong? Although I'm curious your take on that. But also, like, what, if you care about human rights in China, if you care about, the cultural and language heritage of the Tibetan people, or the right of someone to learn about Tiananmen Square, like, how do you even think about this current moment and where things are going?
Well, in terms of were we wrong, I think we have to ask what the alternatives were. It was a reasonable proposition, in fact, a proposition shared by an awful lot of Chinese people, that the steady improvement, the growth in the economy, the growth of the middle class, would lead to greater political liberalization, freedoms, and more sanctity of contracts, rule of law. That logic is not fundamentally flawed. Second, history hasn't ended.
Yeah,
we really
yeah.
don't know how
Yeah,
this
yeah.
story ends.
Yeah.
What we
That's a
do
good
know
point.
is that in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis,
Yeah.
which convinced the Chinese that the American model had some pretty serious cracks in
Yeah.
it.
Called Glass-Steagall.
Yes.
That is a nerdy joke,
that's
man.
a good fucking.
I'm proud and embarrassed
Yeah.
all at once.
Here
Sorry,
we are.
continue, Dan.
And in the aftermath of the Iraq War and
Yeah.
the Afghanistan War, where the Chinese started asking themselves, is this Pax America really poxy, or it looks pretty violent?
Yeah.
Do we really want this? Is this right? And then with the fall of Ba'athist governments and the Arab Spring and color revolutions, the Chinese Communist Party had an epiphany. And the epiphany went something like this: oh shit, we
Yeah.
could be next. And we need to double down, we need to crack down, we need one-man rule, enough of this sort of collective leadership.
Yeah.
We got to pick one of our number who's going to be a hard ass, and because China needs to be ruled with an iron hand, et cetera. And we got Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
So over the last 6 years, we've seen two things. One is, retrogression in terms of political space, and it's bad, it's serious, and it's been augmented by the tremendous surge in Chinese wealth and Chinese national power. They're big enough, strong enough, they can do a lot of things that they hadn't been able to do before.
And the technology that allows them to surveil people.
That is
Yeah.
the second part.
Yeah, yeah.
So we've
Never seen this, yeah.
seen Big Brother, but we've never seen Big Brother with big data.
No, it's
Yeah,
never
it's-
happened
it's
in the history of the
terrifying.
world that this capacity was in the hands of a system that was going to use it full tilt.
So this experiment is either a pendulum or a spiral.
Yeah.
We don't know if it's going to swing back or if it's going to intensify. I mean, obviously there are pretty fundamental humanistic impulses, the urge for freedom, the urge for fairness, the urge for justice. The Communist Party of China has its hands full trying to contain, control, and suppress, but it hasn't been proven yet that
Yeah.
new technology won't
Yeah.
give it the edge.
So you guys were in a lot of situation room meetings with me too, where we'd be discussing a really hard thing, and then President Obama would be sitting there, and he'd have to make the decision, and everyone around the table would restate the problem in some
Yeah,
creative
yeah.
way, and then not say a fucking thing about what to do about it, right? So I feel like you hear that a lot from Democratic presidential candidates when it comes to China. They all
Yeah.
talk about the rise of China being like one of the greatest geopolitical challenges we face, but rarely do you hear, therefore we must. So do you guys have like a 30 to 60 second kind of like 3-point plan for these candidates for what they should be doing?
Yes. In the words of the great American political philosopher Melania Trump, we should fucking be better.
Yeah.
So what does that mean?
I mean, just because I picked some of this, I'll tee this up, and then Danny, I think, can fill in more detail. But number one, you need a China policy that is an Asia policy,
Right.
right? So do we have the capacity to just change things in China? No. But if we are deepening our relationships around China, right, and this is what we did. So, we have a trade agreement that raises the standards to where we want them on things like intellectual property with all the other countries in the Asia Pacific that matter. You set a standard that you then try to hold China to with other countries, right? I think it's more of a reason to double down on not just our alliance relationships, but getting our allies closer together, right? So that the Japanese are closer to the Indonesians and the Singaporeans and the Indians, so that there are these other countries that, it's not so much containing China, but shaping the environment within which China is rising, right? So the shorthand would be your China policy has to be a regional policy. And you have to be working on all the things you care about: high trade standards, the promotion of democracy and human rights, responsible stakeholders in the international community. You want all of those things to be in the ether in the Asia Pacific in a way that allows us to either leverage China if we're confronting them, or hopefully absorb a rising China into a more mature set of arrangements in the Asia Pacific. And then with China, it's a classic case where we want a ledger of things where we can work with them, and on climate change, we need them to help us transition the global energy economy, and pick your spots on where you confront them on trade irritants, on technology irritants. But the basic principle I would have, and that the Democrats running should have, is when we confront China, we should not do it alone, as Trump is doing. We should be working with other countries in the Asia-Pacific region, with the Europeans as well, so that we're confronting China as an international community, saying, we're not trying to hold you down, China. We are trying to hold you to the same standards that we hold everybody else to.
I totally agree with that. I think, number one, we have to get our act together. For the allies and partners to work with us and to have some faith in us, they have to see that we can make our own government work. So
that's a
our
good point.
governance matters.
Yeah.
That makes me sad.
Yeah,
Our-
no, it's true. That's very true.
Yeah.
Our economy matters, not just $1 trillion tax break for the rich, and not just a Google and a Facebook, but we have to be seen tackling our own problems, including problems of infrastructure, problems of education, problems of immigration. I mean, not only do we want a country that will attract the best minds from all over the world and keep them in our labs and our companies, but we want an immigration policy that will let them in the goddamn door in the first place.
Yeah.
I completely agree with Ben that we need to work with partners and present a united front. And America First is not exactly a flag that a lot of other countries are going to rally around. So countries to support us, to work with us, because remember, leadership isn't bossing people around. Leadership is other people deciding that they want to follow you because they have faith that you have the best interests of the group, of the world in mind. For us to be able to collect that kind of unified front, they have to know that we believe in something. They have to know what our values are, and they have to see those values at work. That is and has been our huge comparative advantage over authoritarian regimes in the past. China has a China dream, but it's only for China. It's for the Chinese. You can become an American, or at least you could until recently. You can't become Chinese.
Right.
There is no export model of the China dream. There certainly is an export model of the American dream, and people around the world are living that, no matter what they call it, because it's about education, it's about opportunities for your kids, it's about institutions that will protect you and protect your rights. So instead of admiring the problem, which is what you're describing, really we need to get to work.
But Danny said something really important, which is that the stuff at home, if I was a candidate, talk about at home, just a couple of quick examples. There's this concern that they're going to beat us in technology, right? Well, the way to beat the Chinese in a technological space race is not to kind of go around and scold countries that buy Huawei. We should be investing, the federal government should be investing in basic research and innovation here, right? You don't want to get beat on artificial intelligence. Get the tech companies together, figure out what the investments are that have to be made for the U.S. to not lose that race. You don't want to have the authoritarian Chinese model beat the democratic model. Then strengthen our democracy at home. Like, voting rights in the United States is actually connected to our ability to go around the world and promote these values. So I think you can articulate, and lastly, by the way, don't fight a forever war in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Guess one thing the Chinese aren't doing as part of their strategy? Spending trillions of dollars fighting fruitless wars in the Middle East, right? So you can draw a whole critique that starts with our own democracy, that goes through our infrastructure and our investments in technology and innovation, that goes to the need to end the forever war, and then gets to the China and Asia piece that's all about positioning the United States and democracy generally to be able to beat back any authoritarian trend that would overwhelm us.